Indigenous peoples constitute only about 3% of the population of Canada. However, the number of Aboriginal women imprisoned is even more disproportionate, 43%. Things are not just worse, they're a lot worse. There is a general failure of government to fund the required specialized pre-sentence assessments for Aboriginal women. The justice system has a practice of cutting and pasting reports with no assistance and lack of proper representation that leads to further systemic disadvantages suffered by Indigenous women. There is also a lack of community resource to help in the prevention of oppression and of the rehabilitation of Aboriginal women. Celeste Haldane, the Chief Treaty Commissioner of BC Treaty Commission, indicated that in the last fiscal year, the Provincial Legal Aid Plan had 5,154 Indigenous criminal clients, but it produced only 79 plans. There is a lack of dedicated resourcing. It comes down to a fundamental human right, as well as an access to justice issue for Indigenous peoples. In a time of reconciliation, investments need to be made, and this is one area that a multidisciplinary approach needs to be taken. The experience of Aboriginal women in federal penitentiaries has been a continuation of the marginalization they've experienced for generations. Issues of isolation and dislocation are commonplace. Aboriginal women find themselves overrepresented and under-resourced in the prison system. They frequently are denied access to culturally and gender-appropriate programming and are underrepresented in terms of parole eligibility. For many Aboriginal women, the circumstances which resulted in their involvement in the criminal justice system is comprised of a complex set of collective and individual life circumstances that have been marked with violence and poverty. In light of this, Aboriginal women present a wide range of programming needs: culturally appropriate and gender appropriate programming, life skills, parenting skills, education, employment, alcohol and substance abuse, anger management, and spiritual programming. In addition, Aboriginal women present a need for additional mental health care and treatment. 1 in every 3 women incarcerated in the Canadian prison system is an Aboriginal. For corrections, that means that the demand is high to provide culturally and gender-appropriate programming, and unfortunately, this just doesn't happen. Compared to all other categories of accused persons, Indigenous women in Canada continue to be jailed younger, they are denied bail more frequently, they are granted parole less often, and hence released later in their sentence and also in their lives. They are overrepresented in segregation, they are overrepresented in remand custody, and are more likely to be classified as high-risk offenders. They are more likely to also have the needs in categories like employment, community integration, and family supports. The portrayal of the squaw is one of the most degraded, most despised, and most dehumanized anywhere in the world. The squaw is the female counterpart of the Indian male savage, and as such, she has no human face. She is lustful, immoral, unfeeling, and dirty. Such grotesque dehumanization has rendered all Native women and girls vulnerable to gross physical, psychological, and sexual violence.
Hello, everybody. On this portion of the PowerPoint, I was supposed to identify anti-oppressive practice approaches, which I gave a short definition and mentioned some of the elements of what anti-oppressive approaches look like anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-heterosexism, anti-ableism, ableism, and the rest. And I did just mention how the Aboriginal justice system have failed to see the connection between the racism and sexism system that has plagued Aboriginal women I did just added a slide of the systematic operative structures to show how measure social problems are linked to the ways our societies are structured rather than the shortcomings of groups and individuals. And you can see how everything is interconnected. Picture. On another note, I did mention that for social workers to be able to empower original women in in the present system, we should also be doing a lot of self-reflexive practice, which means that our approaches should be to empower, not to oppress. And we should also work more on our personal biases, our use of power, and understand that we should be aware of our potential to oppress Aboriginal women, in the sense that we should be thinking that we are the experts and not listening to them, which has to be the contrary, that we will need to listen to them. Experts. So on that note, I did talk about I did throw a little bit of light on the different levels of empowerment. On the micro level, there are programs, the programs just need to be more gender-based, and we should be helping these women from a respectful perspective. We should be being allies to them, and we should be learning from them to understand more what they need by being supportive, by advocating for them, and by helping them transition from the prison system into the society. And I also did mention that on the macro level, the government should work in collaboration with these women by funding lots of projects to help them heal, like opening lounges that are specific for women, and also by investing wealth to build businesses and investments in the Aboriginal community.
To this point in the presentation, we've talked about the conventional experience of Indigenous women with the criminal justice system and explored anti-oppressive and critical practices and lenses as they relate to Indigenous women in the criminal justice system. We'll move now to discussing and looking at some literature as it exists on this topic. The topic of Indigenous women and their experience in the criminal justice system is actually quite well represented across journal articles, texts, multimedia, and there's a tremendous body of work found in Australia, North America, and the UK. For this assignment and presentation, we're going to speak specifically about 2 articles, and we will be offering some resources to follow for those who are interested in a deeper dive in the topic. The first article that we'll be examining is Changing Narratives, Colonized Peoples, Criminology and Social Work, written by Coonan and Rowe. Chris Coonan and Simone Rowe have both been well published on the topic of the experience of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system in Australia. And we selected this article because we felt it was relevant because it specifically cited social work and had some very strong assertions for the practice of social work and the field of social work as it relates to Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system. Here the article mirrors actually what we've presented to you thus far, that Western ideologies have been dominant in practice and research and therefore have really embedded colonized ideals and have really propelled the suffering of Indigenous people within the criminal justice system, and that reflexive practice and greater engagement and an integration of post-colonial theory is really in its infancy, and that's why we're still seeing, though we have a greater anti-oppressive lens and call to change, we're not seeing that change thus far. In the previous slide, we really explained how the article posits the failings thus far. And the way forward is what Kunin and Rowe propose and talk about: transformative practice, transformative ideologies, and paradigm shifts that really are inclusive of Indigenous scholars, Indigenous subjects and research, and a changing in narratives. And I think echoing what you saw earlier in that reflexive practice and how that ties to an anti-oppressive lens. The next article we move to is "I've Never Been So Free in All My Life, Healing Through Aboriginal Ceremonies in Prison" by Felice Uden. And this article was presented, and we decided to present in conjunction with the previous article because it actually depicts the intervention that Kunin and Rowe are espousing and that we've also talked about and will talk about further in the presentation. It's a research article, and it has great qualitative experience from women in prison who have been ceremonies been embedded in leisure time, and that holistic approach has been embedded. And in the next two slides, there's a bit more detail and a citation from one of the women that really, we think, depicts how there can be change from what we have seen in the criminal justice system to what could be possible if adoptions and holistic practice and change actually was facilitated and fostered. And as we close out this section, this slide and the following slide holds some statistics, some data, and also some resource links that for those who may be interested, and speak to the calls to action. There are 18 specific call to action in the Truth and Reconciliation around criminal justice and the treatment of Indigenous peoples. And we've also embedded a link to Cindy Glado. There was quite a remarkable and groundbreaking decision with respect to her trial recently.
In Canada, the death of women prisoners in Kingston led to the appointment of a government task force to develop prison policies more responsive to the needs of women, and the Corrections and Conditional Release Act stipulated that programming must be gender-specific and Aboriginal culturally appropriate. Across Canada, 5 new women's prisons were opened as a result. These prisons reflect a more respectful and dignified environment where the prisoners can be empowered to make meaningful and responsible choices. The concept of a healing lodge offered programs that reflect Aboriginal people's cultures, traditions, and beliefs, and addressed the needs of prisoners through teaching, ceremonies, and interaction with elders, family, and nature. The Okima Ochi Healing Lodge in Saskatchewan was designed in attempts to operate based on these principles. Daily, women gather to participate in the morning smudge in the circular lodge built as a soaring timber structure with a central fireplace. The lodge contains both single and family residential units, and children stay with their mothers. The focus on healing was to be the priority for women offenders. The Lodge is guided by 5 principles, including empowerment, meaningful and responsible choices, respect and dignity, supportive environment, and shared responsibility. The philosophical model for the Healing Lodge is represented by this circle, depicting life in Aboriginal culture as a never-ending spiral of growth. Beginning with the inner circle are the Aboriginal women incarcerated at the lodge. They are at the center of the lodge and of the healing process. It is at this point that the residents make the decision to begin their healing journeys. The next circle represents the aunties, who actively support, assist, and guide the decisions made by the prisoners. They are responsible for the overall direction of services and activities at the lodge and work to empower prisoners to make meaningful and responsible choices. The third circle represented the lodge's corporate relationship with the commissioner, and the outermost circle represents both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities who support and assist the lodge with its mandate to reintegrate women offenders at the safest, most appropriate time in their sentence. The focus of the relationships is the sharing of expertise and an exchange of learning. Tools used in the Healing Lodge include both circle work and community engagement. The lodge involves elders, traditional teachers, and medicine people in their ceremonies, teachings, and counseling. There is an emphasis on respect for life and the interconnections of all beings and the earth itself, importance of community, the medicine wheel, which is holistic, spiritual, emotional, physical, psychological, and addressing the imbalances through traditional, cultural, and spiritual ceremonies, teachings, and counseling. The focus is on restoring the inmate's pride, dignity, and worth. One example of a counseling program offered at the Healing Lodge is the Neck and Eat Horse program, which specifically addresses grief. Its focus is for inmates to connect with self, language, spirituality, and ceremony through the horse and the horse's role in the Cree culture. The challenge is if the inmate is not Cree. There are many different Aboriginal peoples represented with their own languages, cultures, and practices. Therefore, programs must be able to service a variety of Aboriginal people. In Australia, Aboriginal people represent only about 3% of the population, yet consistently comprise close to 40% of the adult prison population. Family and land lie at the core of Aboriginal life, so to meet the prisoners' needs, the Department of Corrective Services instituted a regional prison policy that Aboriginal prisoners serve their sentence near their home country and family to reduce the anguish or feelings of threat and help to empower and continue connections for the prisoners in their rehabilitation. The West Kimberley Regional Prison, opened in 2012, was designed under a community consultation model which recognized Indigenous prisoners' cultural, kinship, family, and community responsibilities and spiritual connections to land. The prison accommodates 30 female prisoners of varying security classifications in a separate women's area. In keeping with the prison philosophy, the houses are grouped so that prisoners can be located according to family ties or language, as well as security rating. The facility has a structured day program with an emphasis on supporting prisoners to develop life, work, and decision-making skills to build self-esteem and the abilities necessary for self-determination. There is great respect given to Aboriginal prisoners in maintaining and fulfilling their cultural obligations and responsibilities, such as the ongoing participation in ceremonies and rituals that help maintain their connection to the land, to their families, and to their community. There is support from the Aboriginal community to address issues identified such as substance abuse and other antisocial behavior, and the development of skills to assist prisoners after release to promote social and economic well-being and independence of Aboriginal people.